Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Food Exchange series on Beyond Pesticides, Can We Shift to a Pesticide-Free World? I'm Claire Kremen, Faculty Director of the Berkeley Food Institute. The Berkeley Food Institute, founded just about a year ago, brings together the College of Natural Resources with the schools of public policy, law, public health, and journalism, along with 75 faculty affiliates that span an even broader range. And our goal is to study and search for ways to create a food system that supports the health of people and the planet. And today, we're delighted to host a panel of experts to discuss how we can shift agriculture away from its dominant reliance on pesticides. Just before I introduce the panelists, I'd like to invite you all to join us after the panel discussion for a brief reception, a wine and cheese reception, and that's going to be just down the hall in room 330. And that way you can have an opportunity to talk with them yourselves. So today we're very pleased to have David Tuller as our moderator. He was a reporter and editor for 10 years at the San Francisco Chronicle. He served as health editor at Salon.com and frequently writes health stories for the New York Times. Then he received a master's in public health at Berkeley in 2006 and a doctorate in public health in 2013 for research into the regulation of endocrine disrupting chemicals. He's currently academic coordinator of Berkeley's concurrent master's degree program in public health and journalism, as well as other projects linking the two fields. We also have Brenda Eskenazi. She is the Jennifer and Brian Maxwell Professor of Maternal and Child Health and Epidemiology at University of California at Berkeley's School of Public Health. For nearly 3 decades, she has studied the effects of environmental exposure to reproductive, perinatal, and children's health. Her research includes the association of exposure to pesticides, solvents, dioxin, cigarette smoke, and caffeine on fetal and child growth and neurodevelopment. She's a contributor to the Surgeon General's report on smoking and women's health and served on the National Academy of Sciences Board of Children, Youth, and Families. Jill Harrison is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Drawing on her own extensive ethnographic research as well as in-depth interviews with regulators, activists, scientists, and public health practitioners, Harrison examines the way industry, regulatory agencies, and different kinds of activists address pesticide drift, connecting their efforts to communitarian and libertarian conceptions of justice. The approach taken by pesticide drift activists, she finds, not only critiques theories of justice undergirding mainstream sustainable agriculture activism, but also offers an entirely new notion of what justice means. And finally, we have Margaret Reeves, who is a senior scientist at Pesticide Action Network. She obtained her PhD in agricultural ecology at the University of Michigan and was a postdoctoral fellow in agronomy at Ohio State. Before joining Pesticide Action Network in 1996, Margaret spent most of 9 years in Central America teaching and conducting research in tropical agricultural ecology. She worked with university colleagues and NGOs to improve productivity of low-input, ecologically sound agricultural methods. At Pesticide Action Network, Margaret focuses on environmental health and justice, particularly farm worker health and safety. Okay.
So I'm happy to be here. Thanks all for coming. Our format's going to be that each of our panelists will give a 5-minute presentation. I'll be harsh. I'll stop you after 5 minutes, so keep it pretty good. So we'll have time and start asking some questions, and then we'll open up for some questions from the audience. So I'm not sure which one of you wants to go first. Okay.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming, everybody. So we were asked to come up with 3 main points as talking points for this. So I'll start by talking about the status of farm workers in this country and just how many people have seen Harvest of Shame, the 1960s film published on Thanksgiving Day by Edward R. Murrow. Well, fast forward several years, and just March 2011, Cesar Chavez's birthday, the Bon Appetit Management Company and United Farm Workers of America published a new report, the Farm Worker Inventory, and the story they tell is very much like the story that Edward R. Murrow told in 1960 about wage theft, poverty wages, horrific housing conditions, sexual abuse, even slavery. And when we talk about pesticide issues on the farm, there's nobody with greater exposure than the farm workers, the nearly 2 million farm workers in the U.S. who toil on U.S. farms. Nothing will happen about reducing the use of pesticides on the farms or improving the lot of farm workers who are exposed to those pesticides unless the farm workers are directly involved in that process and unless those processes involve those other issues. When you talk to farm workers in the field, yes, pesticides are a huge, huge issue, as we'll talk about, and I'm sure Brenda will give you some more details. But they need to know where their next meal is coming from and that they're not going to be deported and that they have a place to live, and the list goes on and on. So that's one point I want to make at the top. Next is that there are two things I want to talk about. One is that I've been a farm worker advocate since the 80s. I've worked with the Farm Labor Organizing Committee in Ohio, with the United Farm Workers here in California. And around 2009, the three major farm worker unions came together, the first revolutionary thing. If you know anything about labor, different unions within a sector don't tend to collaborate. That was phenomenal. Not only did they come together, but they came together looking at this marketplace situation where we have a plethora of labels and standards, from forest stewardship to marine stewardship to Rainforest Alliance to all sorts of other green labels. And they said, can we come up with a voluntary standard for industrial scale agriculture, where most of the farm workers are employed, that will address the labor issues that we have struggled with the last 50 years through collective bargaining agreements to address, and we have not been able to do so as much as we would like. Is there an alternative? That's the second revolutionary thing. They are not giving up on the power of collective bargaining, but they're looking at some viable alternatives. So after they did that, they came together on those two fronts. Then they reached out and they realized that, well, we're not going to be able to do this if it's just labor. We need to find out what moves people, what moves voters, what moves consumers. And they found, to no great surprise, that people really don't care about farm workers that much, but they care a lot about pesticides, they care about food safety, they care about animal welfare. So why don't we bring these together and come up with a standard that addresses labor, food safety, and pesticide reduction? We're not doing the animal welfare for now. And the next thing is that they realize this needs to be a multi-stakeholder initiative. It will not work if it's just the farm workers. It will not work if it's the top-down telling growers what to do. So it's Costco, Bon Appetit, from the buyers, large strawberry grower in California, Pesticide Action Network on the pesticide piece of that standard, and two food safety advocate organizations, Consumer Federation of America and Center for Science in the Public Interest, plus a few others, and other farm worker advocate groups. And together we have put together what's called the Equitable Food Initiative. And that is, and I'm going to make it real brief because I'm sure there'll be more comments, but that is the standard that we are promoting as a complement to other efforts that are going on, like the Agricultural Justice Project, which is focused at the small family farm organic scale farming operation. And every time I talk about the Equitable Food Initiative, I make absolute certain to say that the Agricultural Justice Project and other projects like that are not competitive, but they are complementary with this. We are working at the industrial scale level. It would be great to do away with industrial ag. That's not happening today, tomorrow, or in the next 10 years, probably, or longer. So at any rate, I think that's another really, really important point to make. And that was super fast, but I'm going to leave it at that, and we can have, was that less than 5 minutes?
That was just about 5 minutes.
Excellent.
Coming on 5 minutes. Excellent timing.
Excellent,
Thank you.
excellent. So leave it at that and take lots of questions later.
Thank you.
Want me to go?
Sure.
Okay. So good afternoon. I represent, I guess, the health side of the issue, and what we really don't know about health of many of the pesticides that are being used. So what we do know, and I'm a relative novice to the whole field of pesticides in food, only the last 15 years, not my whole career, is that pesticides used in the fields make their way into the homes, that we can actually measure some of the pesticide residues in the homes. We also know that the pesticide residues in the homes make their way into the children, specifically children. Why? Because children crawl on the floor, they put their hands in their mouths, so they're more likely to get exposed. They're also smaller, so the same dose, the same exposure is likely to have a greater effect on developing organisms. Also, they don't have the way to detoxify many of these chemicals until they're older. We also know that from the work that we've done in the Trimacos project, and the Trimacos project, I'll go into a little bit of detail in a second, is that exposures in children are related to health and development of children. Do we know that that's causally related? No. Are we likely to know that it's causally related by studies on health of humans? No. So we have to live with a certain amount of uncertainty. The Trimacos project is unique. It is the Center for Health Assessment of Mothers and Children of Salinas, or Trimacos, which means kids in Mexican Spanish. And it is a long-term project starting with 600 pregnant women in the Salinas Valley. They were mostly farm worker families, not all farm worker families, but most of them were. And they were mostly, if you will, undocumented farm worker families. We don't know because we don't ask, because we don't want to know. But we have followed these women and the children that came out of those pregnancies till 14. The children are turning 14 this month. And over the years, we have identified the relationships of different exposures and health. And it's from that information that we have, I hate to say this, probably some of the only data on the relationship of in utero exposure to these chemicals and effects on human health. Some of the things that that I've observed over these years is that not all children and adults are equally vulnerable or equally susceptible. We've identified that there may be genetic susceptibility, that some people, by virtue of some particular polymorphism, may be more susceptible to the exposures than others. And we really haven't studied this to the fullest, and that poverty and malnutrition may also increase vulnerability to some of these chemicals that we know to be neurotoxicants. They affect the human brain, they affect animal brain, that we know. Human brain, it's harder to study. We also know that farm worker families, like Margaret was talking about, for the most part live in poverty. And that because they live in poverty, they live in poor housing stock. And with poor housing stock, you're not only more likely to have infestations, but you're more likely to use pesticides to control those infestations. So in a way, farm worker housing is like a double whammy. You live on the fields, you're exposed to the pesticides from the drift, from the residues. You get it from your food, like we all do, some residues in our food, but you also get more of a different kind of group of pesticides because you've got more infestations in the house. Now, on a positive note, is that in the last decade in California, I can't speak for the whole country because California is unique. We have something called the pesticide use reporting data, which means that all the pesticides that are used are reported and it's enforced, that there has been a marked decrease in insecticides, a very marked decrease in insecticides over the last decade that we have seen since the years we started working in the Salinas Valley and in California in general. And in part, I'd like to think it's motivated by the pressures of us doing the research, by advocates, but it's also in part motivated by the fact that these chemicals cost money and they're expensive. And that's one of the motivators for the reduction in the use. One thing that I'm getting very interested now in is organic growing. Organic growing is not chemical-free, and we're under a misperception if we think that it is. And probably the chemical that's most heavily used in California for agriculture is sulfur. Sulfur is known to be a respiratory and a dermal irritant. We are now just beginning to look to see whether we see health effects of living near sulfur applications. But we also know that there have been other chemicals, like rotenone, which was used in organics, which had been very little studied on human health, and it was banned because of potential health effects. So we shouldn't be under the misperception that just because we're not using conventional pesticides, that those chemicals that are used in organics are necessarily safe for health. So in line with the topic of today, can we move to a pesticide-free agriculture? My question really is, as a health person and not as an agriculture person, is what I see in the Salinas Valley amongst farm workers and a lot of people that are food insecure with hunger. I'm seeing lots of kids in my study that are hungry. And what I want to know and I want to be sure of is that if we move to a pesticide-free agriculture, that we can assure that we can produce and transport enough wholesome and safe food to populations that may be at higher risk of neurodevelopmental and other developmental problems because they can't get enough food. So I think I'll end there.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, everybody. Excuse me, lost my voice a couple weeks ago, so I'm really glad that there's a microphone here today. So I want to make 3 points, and I'll try to do this within my allotted 5 minutes. And the points that I want to make are based on the research that I conducted as a graduate student at UC Santa Cruz from 2002 to 2009. I actually finished in 2006, but kept doing the research for a number of years after that. And the research that I did was on political conflict over pesticide drift, so the off-site movement of agricultural pesticides away from where they're applied and into different social spaces, like a school or a neighborhood or another field where people are working. And I looked at political conflict over it, so disagreements between activists and regulators over how big the problem is, what causes it, and what should be done about it. And I focused my attention in that research, especially, not exclusively, but especially on soil fumigants, because I think we have an obligation to target the worst in pesticides that are out there in terms of highest toxicity and highest potential for drift. We need to choose our battles as scholars. So I focused my attention there. And in contrast to perhaps some other pesticides that are out there, overall use of soil fumigants in the United States is not decreasing over time. We see changes between one fumigant and another. But this is a class of pesticides that's very much still an intractable part of the agricultural chemical landscape. So the first point I want to make is that scientific data, certain scientific data on the impacts of pesticides are crucial, and this is where I think research like the Chamaco study is really important. But they represent the tip of the iceberg, and we know that there's a bigger iceberg that we can't see very well, if at all, and that our regulations need to account for the entire iceberg, including that part that we can't see. So if you talk to pesticide regulatory officials about pesticide drift, they'll tell you that it's a series of rare accidents that happen when people break the rules. If you go and talk to pesticide drift activists, they'll tell you a different story. They'll tell you that it's an everyday phenomenon, that it's something that is somehow both at the same time terrifying and normal. I conducted many different interviews with politically active agricultural community residents and other activists. Some of them are farm workers or former farm workers, many are not. And they'll give you all kinds of reasons why people don't report their pesticide exposures. Maybe they don't know, there's no symptoms, or they try, but they can't get to the doctor, they don't have any evidence, or clinic staff won't report their symptoms as a pesticide exposure, or they can't for lack of data. But there's all kinds of other social relations in agricultural communities that render pesticide drift invisible. And we can think of all kinds of different dynamics relating to poverty, fear of job loss, legal status issues, racism, a regulatory culture of industry protection. All of these things combined together produce a situation in which most exposures to pesticides are not reported or understood or acknowledged. So pesticide regulators need to strengthen pesticide regulations to account for the influence of these social inequalities and relations of oppression. And this is where social science research, I think, can play an important role, as these findings help to justify precaution-based restrictions on the use of the most toxic and drift-prone pesticides. We know enough already to take more precaution-based action in terms of regulatory restrictions. My second point is that many people are asking the wrong questions about the pesticide problem. And here, I'm not the only one to make this argument. Julie Guthman, who's also in our midst, and plenty of other people have made this argument too. A lot of people are asking the wrong questions about the problems that we're so deeply concerned about. So many activists and everyday people are concerned about the impacts of pesticides on public health, but they focus their concern by thinking and talking about what to eat and what to buy. And this, to me, is a dangerous approach. The first question, what to eat, frames the problem as one that affects consumers. It sidelines the problem of pesticide drift, where many major pesticide drift hazards do not leave residues on food that would pose a threat to consumers. So we have this preoccupation with pesticide residues on food that doesn't attend to some of the worst pesticide drift problems. Soil fumigants are a perfect case in point here. The second question, what to buy, frames the problem as a market-based one. If we could just get our purchasing decisions right, we could nip this problem in the bud. Many activists I have observed even explicitly dismiss the potential for regulatory reform as a waste of time. And I understand where this sentiment is coming from, but it lets government off the hook, absolving it of responsibility for stronger regulations that protect all people, not just those who can afford organic food. Market-based initiatives aren't bad. My point is that they're not enough. We need carrots and sticks. The danger comes when we only think about carrots and forget about the sticks of regulatory reform. My third point is that we need to think carefully about justice and what vision of justice our actions and our arguments support, even when we don't intend for them to. And here I'm building on the work of Melanie Dupuy, David Schlossberg, and a number of other folks who use political theories of justice from political philosophy to think about the different ideas of justice that are floating around out there in the world. Justice means a lot of different things to different people, and different ideas of justice have different metrics of success and different consequences. That's why we need to think about them. They actually matter. In recent decades, the U.S. pesticide regulatory agencies and other government institutions in the United States, well beyond the realm of environmental regulation, have become eviscerated. Budget cuts, restrictions on regulation, calls for individual responsibility, reliance on voluntary, educational and collaborative alternatives to regulatory controls. This is what in social sciences we call neoliberalization. Industry loves it. It serves their purposes precisely. Now, this trend aligns with a libertarian conception of justice, or an entitlement theory of justice, which calls for solving problems through the market and frames government interventions as unjust, as wrong. Activists and others who frame the pesticide problem as one of what to buy and what to eat, and who have given up on regulatory reform, play right into this line of argument. They unwittingly support the neoliberalization of the state, the shift of responsibility to individuals, and the libertarian vision of justice that rationalizes these changes. I see hope in pesticide drift activists, along with the broader environmental justice movement, who reject this idea. They reject the wholesale reliance on market-based measures. Instead, the environmental justice movement emphasizes that poverty and racism prevent many people, including those most burdened by pesticide pollution, from voting with their dollars. Thus, they call for stronger regulations as the socially just strategy for dealing with environmental problems like the pesticide problem. And they marshal a very different idea of justice, and I don't have time to spell it out for you here, but it's a combination of egalitarian principles, of ideas of participatory fairness, and ideas of recognition of group-based oppression and privilege, and a reliance on market-based transaction did not help us to account for all of these different ideas of justice. In my mind, the environmental justice movement shows why the libertarian, neoliberal path is so problematic. And they offer a vision of justice that I find to be morally defensible because it accounts for the unequal and oppressive world that we actually live in. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for three somewhat different perspectives on the question. And so my first question is, given your perspectives, the title of the panel, as we have it here, is Beyond Pesticides. Can we shift to a pesticide-free agriculture? How would you each have framed the question differently, or would you have framed it the same way? What question would you have asked as sort of the basis for our discussion? Any of you?
Well, I'll say something
I can put the question another way.
I was going to respond. I actually wanted to appreciate what Jill said and say that I failed to say that our bottom line is also policy change. And that we actually see a marketplace initiative as a means to get there. So from Pesticide Action Network's perspective, the absolute bottom line needs to be public policy change. But we also see that the processes that we've been applying to that policy change move at a snail's pace at best. And that we see that if in fact we can demonstrate that industrial scale agriculture can be viable with reduced dependence on highly hazardous pesticides, then that, in fact, can be a strong engine of change that we would then apply towards that building the public will for that necessary policy change. But I didn't answer your question about what we should rename the...
Well, is there a question that's essentially left out of this framing, do you think? Or that's not addressed or that's sidestepped by this particular framing of the question?
Go ahead.
I think it's perfectly permissible to focus on pesticides and to, in terms of thinking about solutions to the problems that we've got in this world, to not try to figure out some silver bullet recommendation or some kind of alternative form of agriculture that accomplishes that remediates all of our problems all at once. I think it's okay to take up the pesticide problem and kind of leave aside some of the other big issues. Mm-hmm. I'm kind of a reformist in that way, in that I don't see fundamental problems with large-scale agriculture necessarily, as long as it serves other kinds of needs, and maybe could serve as part of a stepping stone to a less toxic agricultural landscape. But in terms of your question about the title, I just, in terms of can we shift to a pesticide-free agriculture, I would just throw in a little bit of nuance in terms of pesticide-free, because I don't think there's a possibility for pesticide-free agriculture. I do think it makes sense to target the worst pesticides.
So pesticide minimization or pesticide reduction or something. And Brenda, how about you?
Well, I think it comes back to the last comment that I made when I gave my 5 minutes, which is, as someone who's not an agricultural person, what I'm really concerned about is that the message that's going out there is that pesticides are bad for your health and therefore you shouldn't eat fruits and vegetables to reduce your pesticide intake. And that's the wrong message. And the bigger concern for me is that I want to make sure that pregnant women, children, people that really need food like we all do, get food and get wholesome food and get food that has the least amount of chemical. But I guess I agree with Jill, although I'm not an agricultural person again, that maybe pesticide-free is too dramatic, and maybe we can support the growing population, the demographic of the growing population worldwide with the food we have right now because of transport and whatever else, and there are people here who know much more than I do. Mm-hmm. But that's my greater concern right now. I feel that, yes, we should reduce pesticides as much as we can, but we need to produce food. And I want to make sure that in the meantime, we also get across the fact that we need to make sure we wash our fruits and vegetables, that we have some power over this, not just policy power.
Well, so it sounds like you're all sort of saying, to a certain degree, there has been a demonization of pesticides. I mean, just the word pesticide sort of, I think, inspires fear and concern among people in general. Is that a warranted attitude that people should have in general?
Yes. I also wanted to add that I think pesticides is a good lens into a bigger issue of what agriculture should be. The bottom line is a sustainable agriculture system socially and economically throughout the world, the U.S. just being one little piece of it. And yes, we can get there. Pesticides, again, is just one piece of the tools that has come to be recognized as part of what large-scale monoculture, agribusiness-owned agriculture is all about. So we can get there, and we can be safer, less pesticides or whatever, but the real bottom line is it's got to be an agricultural system that feeds everybody, that doesn't contaminate the community and the people and the workers, and I think it can get there. We have lots and lots of evidence around the globe of very effective agroecological practices that are being implemented at every scale in every country all over the world. And if you look at organic production here, you have virtually every crop can be grown successfully and viably under organic production. Not saying, as you say, that organic is pesticide-free, but generally speaking, a hell of a lot safer.
Did you have anything you wanted to add? No? Okay. Well, you've all sort of laid out a certain sort of vision of where you'd like to see things go. What kind of changes do you think are necessary to our, political and social structures for those to actually have a realistic chance of happening? Or is it just kind of a fantasy land that we can really make inroads into sort of the industrial production model and make changes in it?
I don't think it's a fantasy land, but part of my interest is, as an educator, is getting my students to think about the realm of possibilities beyond what's possible today. And I think this is where, you get into a sticky problem of people thinking that you're living in an ivory tower and you're making a set of recommendations that policymakers can't, or activists who are on the ground can't do anything with today. But I actually think we have an obligation as academics to step back and think about what kind of world do we want to live in? What's possible, maybe not today, maybe not this year, but over a longer time span? And are we on that path? Is that where we're heading? Or are we heading in a different direction that doesn't align with our vision of what a just world looks like? And I actually think that's an important role that we have to play as academics, is to step back and take some of that big picture perspective.
I want to say something about what we shouldn't do.
Okay.
I think that up until now, unless we have proven that a chemical is hazardous to either animals or ecology or to humans, we don't regulate that chemical. And as someone who does the health research, it's not possible that we can continue in this way of approaching things. That we cannot rely on, for example, human health studies, which are way too expensive to conduct and are totally imperfect. We can't look, as in the animal studies, one chemical at a time, because we're exposed to swimming pools of chemicals, and that we're never going to be able to look at toxicology in the way that it's really appropriate to look at. So we need to do something that's better, to be more preemptive, to reduce risk. And so far, the regulatory process has not approached that appropriately.
It seems to me one of the issues I've noticed in the regulatory process is that what they like to use what I think of as a criminal defense paradigm, that you have to prove my chemical beyond a reasonable doubt guilty of X, morbidity before you can actually do anything about it. And it seems kind of good for criminal defense. It doesn't seem right for chemicals. But I have a feeling that it plays, that approach plays into some sort of prototypical American sense of fair play, and that when it's presented that way, it does seem fair to people that should be the standard, even if it's absurd.
I think the absurdity is that it seems fair to the corporate interests that are behind maintaining the regulatory risk assessment process that we have. I also want to speak to policy that we actually do have and can promote. So we've just finished an arduous 2.5-year process of negotiating the Farm Bill. We did get some good pieces in that Farm Bill, despite the overall Tea Party and Republican efforts to undermine it entirely, and they wanted to do away with food stamps altogether, but they didn't do that. But what I do want to say is there are some good pieces of policy in there that support sustainable production processes. There are also good pieces of policy at a state level. And there are examples of, and then here's a whole other body that was most relevant to universities like UC Berkeley and the UC system is the land grant system. There's a huge opportunity there for the land grant systems to actually do what they were supposed to do, and that is serve the farmers of the country rather than the Novartis and Syngentas and Monsantos of the country. So there's there's policy level there that can be addressed from the university community as well as the state and federal level policy work that is currently ongoing and we can promote further.
I was just going to say, I mean, you're absolutely right in terms of your characterization of the burden of proof with pesticide regulation. We also, though, do have some vestiges of support for the precautionary principle within the environmental regulatory structure in the United States, and it's not utilized nearly to the capacity that it is.
Can you describe what you mean?
Just some micro details within specific policy measures, and I would have to open my book right now to dig up where they are.
You mean specific legislation that incorporates some aspect of that?
Yep,
and that aren't utilized to the degree that they could be?
Exactly, yep.
I see.
Well, without detail, the city and county of San Francisco does have precautionary language in some of their public policies. I don't know the detail, but that's an example here.
What is the role of the, well, actually, one thing I want to ask you, Jill, based on what you talked about, the sort of split between those who, promoting sort of market-based, local, communitarian, sort of the market-based sort of local food movement versus the people who can't afford that, and that's not really an option for them. And want to focus, and the ones who focus on the local food movement maybe reject the regulatory kind of emphasis. Do you see that? Sorry about that. Do you see that strict dichotomy between those two approaches? I mean, are people really rejecting the regulatory approach if they choose the other one, or is it more that that's what they're sort of focusing on? Or is there competition between those, or should they be complementary approaches?
They can be complementary. I think Margaret Reeves is a good example of that. The Pesticide Action Network is a good example of an institution that does both and supports a lot of different kinds of measures. And we're going to need a really interesting array of institutions in order to not just restrict the use of the most toxic and drift-prone pesticides, but also continue to develop viable alternatives that are more socially just and ecologically sustainable. And so they're not necessarily mutually exclusive at all. My concern is the increasing reliance strictly on market-based measures of people giving up and backing out and from that kind of political engagement. And so I think there's actually just a big empirical question here, several empirical questions here of to what extent is that happening? To what extent can these cool measures like the Equitable Food Initiative, did I get that right? Yep. Can they, we were talking about this over lunch, can they be marshaled to help leverage more long-lasting, broad-scale policy reforms to benefit all people later on? Or do they kind of make people complacent and further kind of pull people away from that kind of regulatory policy debate and engagement? And I think that's a big question mark. I don't know what the relationship is between these different kinds of measures. I think there's more research that we could do on that. Well, I think it's just, to me, it's more of there's a danger sign.
Of people becoming too focused on that aspect. And
well, yeah, I mean, the alternative food initiatives they feel good, they feel a lot better than lobbying, and I see, there's a lot of good reasons why people give up on lobbying in Sacramento or Washington, D.C. and want to pick up their fork and grow a garden. And there's really good reasons for it. There's a lot. But it gets dangerous if it becomes one or the other, I think.
What do you see? I mean, this brings up the question of what is the role of the public then in affecting some of these changes that we're talking about? What role should the public play in terms of, say, helping move towards a more precautionary approach? Does the public play a role? What should they be doing? And do you see the general public having an effect at this point, or being passive and not doing much? Anyone?
I always have something to say. I see the role of the public in twofold, as Jill pointed out. First, in terms of marketplace, when there are alternatives out there, people can make decisions, especially those who are economically able to do so. And we want to see the public step up when we have public policy campaigns. So just one little example in this Equitable Food Initiative, or two pieces. One is it requires all growers, not just in California, to report their pesticide use. Now that is something that there's precedent for in California. Nobody else, except for a little bit in Oregon and Washington, some in New York, actually have to report that. But every grower in the Equitable Food Initiative will have to. That sets a precedent for policy change down the line. It also requires things that farm workers, it also requires better training for farm workers, which is something right now we're pushing for at US EPA for improved worker protection standard. We've been working on that for 13 years, and we hope that this kind of initiative will let folks know that, in fact, growers can do it. And they can do it making a viable living while the farm workers are making a viable living and the retailers do it. And I can go into why the retailers are on board, but I've already spoken a lot.
We have found that actually most of the farm workers that we've been dealing with have not been trained on worker protection standard. And because of that, we actually trained our staff to become trainers in worker protection standards so that we could train as part of our study, which is not really our mandate, to train other people so that they could learn how to protect themselves. There's really not, and this is the Salinas Valley, this is a major agricultural area in California. So I'm really concerned that the WPS is not really happening.
It will now.
Hopefully.
But who's going to enforce that?
But in terms of, what's the public's role in this? The Tea Party does a really good job of getting people out to vote, and there's really basic ways in which everybody can vote. I mean, it's a pretty minimal amount of time. I don't know about you all, but my students profess to be environmentalists in one way or another, but they have given up on voting. They don't think it's useful. And I think that's a really kind of simple, just specific thing that you could recommend to people that can actually, I think, make a difference. But that kind of engagement, you can support organizations like PAN that do work that you think is great, or whatever organizations align with your values. You can support them in a little way or a big way. There's different ways, I think, for the public to participate, and that the public needs to be participating that extend well beyond what you buy when you go to the store.
Well, I mean, I always find myself in a quandary when I go shopping because I never know quite what to buy and how to weigh all these. If I buy this, am I harming somebody? Or now it's like if I get quinoa, or the Bolivian's starving because I'm buying quinoa. And so all these choices, when you go to Whole Foods or whatever, and it feels sort of awful, but there's all this stuff there at the same time. But you feel like a horrible person, maybe sometimes shopping in Whole Foods, or I do. And I just as a personal, an individual level. How do you all shop, and how do you all make those decisions when you're shopping, weighing all these kind of factors? The cost, the pesticides, or organic, who's picking the food? How do you do it in a way that you feel like you're inserting a positive energy into the world and not a negative?
A personal response? Well, I can say that I buy mostly organic, and that's not because I absolutely know that chemicals have health consequences on my health, but I do know that there are tens of, probably hundreds of farm workers that are poisoned every year. That's clear. We have the data for that. And if I can do anything to prevent that. Now, where I get into trouble is the locavore versus the organic. Mm-hmm. And we live in California. I spend a lot of time in New York City. And those choices are very hard to make because you can't get organic, you can't get local that easily.
In New York.
In New York City. In New York City.
Right.
Imagine if we were in the middle of the United States, right? And the choices are very difficult to make.
And what's the weighing of the locavore versus organic? I mean, what goes into that calculation for you?
It depends on what the particular fruit or vegetable is. If it's blueberries, it's different.
It's a false choice. You don't have to pit the two against each other. I mean, they serve different kinds of purposes, some overlapping.
So how do you make your shopping choices?
I buy a lot of organic stuff because I have a good income and I can afford it, and I do it as much for myself as for the people who live in agricultural communities near fields and who work in fields. But I don't consider it the hallmark of my imprint as a citizen on Earth. It's just part of what I do.
Well, I try to buy mostly real food as opposed to processed food. I have been a member of a community-supported agriculture farm since '97. I like going to farmers markets because even if it's not organic, which it's easy to get here, you can know your farmer and support the local economy. But it's, I forgot what else I was going to say. Well, and then I battle with my 13-year-old about the processed food she wants to buy.
Well, I have more questions I can ask, but I mean, it's 4 o'clock and we have some more time, and I want to open it up to questions at this point. And if there are no questions at this point, I can keep on going and asking questions, but I'm assuming that we do have some questions in the audience. Yeah. Oh, we have a mic? Okay.
Hi, thank you. I'm interested in regulatory actions like moratoriums, such as the one in Oregon on neonicotinoids, or what the EU has done to put a moratorium on them. And I guess specifically kind of, is there science that goes on to actually evaluate these pesticides during the moratoriums, and how does that relate to future regulations on some of these high, pesticides that are really high on people's radars right now?
I assume that question is for me. I'm not sure about the studies on the science during the moratoriums. More the important evaluations would be, does use go down? And I guess you're talking about, is there any impact on the production processes themselves? I presume people are looking at that, and I don't have answers to any particular examples of moratoriums or moratoria. But those are excellent examples of what will help push policy in this country. Back in the 70s, the U.S. was light years ahead of Europe, and now we have fallen far behind in terms of GE crops and neonicotinoids. And so we're looking to our brothers and sisters in Europe to give us some examples and try to use that as precedent to move similar policy here.
I just want to make one comment. We just recently looked at the neonicotinoids in California, and there's very, very little that's used in agriculture. And to add one more thing, there are no human health studies that I know of. So
I was just going to say, more generally, in terms of restrictions on pesticide use, we do have positive examples of where regulatory restrictions have helped to drive development of alternatives and to help drive farmers to adopt less toxic alternatives. In the Food Quality Protection Act, restrictions on organophosphates is a nice example of that. So the farmers knew in advance that their pesticides that they'd been relying on would be restricted precisely to protect human health. And in anticipation, many, with collaborations from university researchers who are trained in agroecology, helped to kind of move away from some of those pesticides in anticipation of their supply that it would be restricted in the near future.
we haven't seen as much organophosphate decrease in the Salinas Valley as one would think. In fact, there hasn't been very much at all. So I think that it has been really restrictive in terms of what you use in the home, but not necessarily in the fields. And of course, people are living right on the fields. So.
I was just going to say, in answer to your question, I just saw a petition circulated recently to Lowe's and Home Depot to stop carrying plants that have been treated with neonicotinoids as a pollinator protection kind of a course of action, obviously based on what happened in Oregon. But so the more pressure that people are putting on large, big box stores like that, I mean, that's where it can start too. I mean, I think that's a great thing. I think it was Credo, I believe, was the petition, if you want to look that up.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm curious what you would say in answer to the question, what is the scariest agricultural toxin that nobody is talking about right now?
Thank you. Good question.
I'd say fumigants as a class.
Yeah, I mean, specifically, people know about methyl bromide because of its degradative effects on the ozone layer. It has a lot of restrictions on its use precisely for that reason. So you maybe could make the argument that it's, you could make the argument that it's more reasonably regulated in terms of restricted than the other fumigants. It's the other ones that don't get the attention that I think we should be particularly concerned about.
The other fumigants.
Just the other soil fumigants.
I'll just add one little thing. Also, what makes it scary is that when you're looking at insecticides and herbicides and fungicides, you can think of less harmful alternatives. When you're looking at alternatives to fumigants, it means changing the entire production system. You cannot continue to produce monoculture in the same place over and over and over again and not have really bad problems with soil-borne pathogens and pests.
Yeah, you have to rotate in crops that aren't nearly as profitable as strawberries. So it becomes a much bigger, messier, more wicked problem, as somebody said earlier, in terms of economic viability.
So there's a relevant article in the New York Times today that says we need GMO wheat. And this relates to the definition of the problem we're trying to solve. And the two authors, who I don't know, say that there's no GMO wheat currently in the United States. And if we had GMO wheat, we could use safer pesticides and make the wheat resilient to that. So not that I'm proposing that that's the right answer, but it sort of illustrates the problem I'd like you to say, how do we solve? Because someone could say, well, I know the answer. If we just fix the crops, we can use chemicals that are safer for humans, and we'll just have GMO crops. So what how do you define the problem that we're trying to solve?
Corporate control of agriculture. This is a whole, I would defer to my colleague Marsha Ishii-Edelman over there, but I'll just, in very brief, there is no evidence that GE crops have helped create more yield. GE crops largely are herbicide-resistant crops, and they have been associated with hundreds of millions of pounds of increase of highly toxic herbicides. There have been very little benefits to any of, despite the multi-millions of dollars invested in research and development of GE crops. But I'll leave it at that.
Just as an add-on to a question that I have, is there like a moral or an ethical difference between GM crops that are designed so that they can take on more pesticides and GM crops that are designed because they provide vitamin D or some other things for nutrients? Should one think about those differently, or should one think about those in the same way?
If you want vitamin D or the other vitamins, eat some real food, and so you don't deny access to food by the people who are being given vitamin A rice. But the other big issue is the one of rights of farmers. That's a huge issue, and the rights of farmers fundamentally to collect their seeds and replant. And the GMO industry is precisely about undermining the democracy of agriculture from the very, very foundation of farming and making decisions.
I'm wary of any technological fix to a problem that's fundamentally one of material inequality, and to me, hunger in the global South is an issue of poverty and extraction and exploitation, and setting up policies so that farmers in the global South are more dependent on a purchased input from one of these massive multinational corporations that makes genetically modified seeds seems like a poor solution to that problem, a very limited solution.
Who's next? No?
I am new to agriculture, but I have a quick question about the incentives that drive transformative change. And given that the toxic response through pesticides is probably the easiest response, are there incentives for corporations or researchers to develop less toxic or non-toxic alternatives to feeding the world, or on whatever scale it is? I'm just wondering if there are other drivers that might be considered that would get us to the place where we're trying to go without necessarily having all of the harm that comes with the way it's done currently.
There are incentives, sure. I mean, there's all kinds of organic farmers out there who see a major profit incentive in going in a less toxic direction.
On a large scale, I mean an industrial scale, like our corporations pay to develop alternatives to the toxic chemicals that they currently use.
That is a major barrier to the advancement of less toxic agriculture.
There is some research in alternatives. The U.S. government spends a fraction of a % on alternatives compared to what it funds in conventional agriculture, including pesticide development. But the other huge piece of this is that viable alternatives or sustainable or organic or agroecological approaches depend a lot on knowledge and experience. And you can't market that and what's the word? Make it a commodity. So there isn't market incentive for that.
But I mean, I don't know, usually when I talk about this with my students, I try to get them to think about kind of think outside the box and step back away from input substitution approaches to dealing with the pesticide problem, and think about really big picture reforms we can make to the Farm Bill in the United States so that we're providing subsidies to farmers who provide really substantial ecological benefits and treat their workers well, rather than benefits to farmers who grow corn, soy, cotton, and sugar. So there's, we could envision a world where we could kind of subsidize farmers and actively encourage them financially to move in that kind of direction. That might help get to some of what you're thinking about. But there was some really neat research going on in public universities today around agroecological alternatives that I think you would find pretty promising.
When are there, will we see sort of some movement from those, do you think, or some results or things that are really actionable?
Oh, we are already.
Yeah, already?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a question first for Professor Eskenazi. I'm interested in what you talked about, your potential trade-off between, health effects from malnutrition and health effects from pesticides. And maybe you could give us a little bit more sense of what that looks like, both, what a kid would look like who's malnourished and what their development looks like as compared to somebody who's exposed to pesticide drift, and then how it sort of appears in the population, whether some people are particularly harmed by this in one case, whereas the other one is maybe less of a harm but more broad scale. And then, Professor Harrison, maybe how does that inform the discussions of justice that you were bringing up earlier also?
I would hope that no one had to make a choice between pesticides and food, that children would have enough food to eat. But I think you're asking about weighing risk, the risk of pesticides versus the risk of malnutrition. To me, that's personally a no-brainer. The risk of malnutrition is much higher from what we can see so far of pesticides. I hate to say that, but it's true. And so my concern is not just in the United States, but globally. I work a lot internationally, that I see a lot of malnutrition, a lot of children that go hungry on a day-to-day basis, and they're lucky if they see one meal a day. In those same communities, I work in Africa, in those same communities, pesticides are widely used, but they're used for malarial control, and some of those chemicals are probably getting into other places as well. But, I think that the bigger issue to me is malnutrition and making sure food is getting around to people. As someone who does the health research on pesticides.
I think it's another false choice. I don't see the issue of guaranteed nutrition and guaranteed safety from toxins as incompatible. And an egalitarian vision of justice would really justify both of those as guaranteed rights for all people. Now that said, there'll be a huge amount of structural reforms required to transition to get there, to that kind of society where we all have a shelter and food and freedom from toxins. But there's also, just in the short term, to help you think about those as not being incompatible goals, there are all kinds of studies out there showing that more diversified, less toxic agricultural systems can be just as productive as pesticide-intensive systems in terms of the amount of food they produce. Now, the question of food production and hunger, there's no clear correlation. We produce all kinds of food that doesn't go to hungry people. So hunger is a consequence of resource inequality and distribution, not of food production per se, in the world we live in.
Yeah.
Thank you all. I'm walked in late, so I'm sorry if you already covered this, but I wanted to know a little bit more about the carbon footprint of the actual trade of pesticides, because oftentimes they're being sent to countries all over the world who the prices are actually reflected in also the fossil fuel prices. And if you could point us to some more resources about that.
I don't know.
struck out on that one.
There may be other people here who do know the answers.
Anybody in the audience have suggestions for that?
All I can say is that pesticides are derived from petroleum, so there's a big carbon footprint, but we can do without them. I do not know the analyses of that.
Yeah.
I have a question. I have a very basic question, maybe, but would you say for all the panelists, is there an agreement in your minds? Would you say that your vision is that the ideal agricultural production system would be one of that integrates eco-agricultural practices, rotation, diversified farming, etc.? I mean, is this what, in an ideal world, we should be moving towards? I just wanted to know if there was at least consensus about that in terms of what's the ideal.
What was that? I say yes.
Good.
Do you have a question?
No.
Are we allowed to ask questions?
Hi. I just have a question for Brenda following up her comment about neonics not being particularly widely used in California. There's actually two questions related to that. First of all,
in agriculture.
Neonics are much more potent pesticides, so they can be used in much smaller doses, which raises the question, should we be moving towards, I mean, given that we are using pesticides that can be applied in smaller doses but are much more potent and targeted, is that a better alternative to large, broad-scale pesticides? But then the other question is I know that the primary mode of application for neonics is with seed treatments, and those are not reported in the spraying data, which is what the California mandate is.
They're used in what?
The seed treatments, so the seeds are treated and then the pesticide grows into the crop. And I've actually tried to look at this myself, but I was unable to find any records of the application of neonics because it's not reported, it's not required. So I'm wondering if you have any comments about how we're able to find that data and where you...
The only data that I have is probably the same data you have, the pesticide use reporting data, and it's just a fraction of the pesticides that are used in California. You've probably seen that. And it doesn't seem to be going up drastically, but you're right, some of this reporting data doesn't take into account the relative toxicity of these chemicals. So, you know, oxydimeton methyl is probably a lot more toxic than malathion, and yet we use oxydimeton methyl a lot. So I don't know about the neonicotinoids and seed.
So, I feel a little bit torn in looking at this. You know, it's easy to criticize the neonics because they are very, very dangerous and frightening chemicals. But at the same time, when you look at just the quantity applied, when you compare that to, so, you know, you treat a seed and it's a very small dose that's very targeted in the ground versus the large-scale application of a aerial pesticide, it's hard to know which of those is a better sort of route in the immediate future.
There's actually one very good tool that is available by the Integrated Pest Management, or IPM Institute, based in Madison. It's called, the acronym is PRIME, P-R-I-M-E, and it actually allows a grower can establish an account and enter his or her data on pesticide use, and what is generated is a risk assessment. So it takes into consideration relative risk and quantity over time. So and there are about 8 or so risk indices, from soil organisms to aquatic organisms to inhalation for worker risk, and on the verge of having both cancer risk and dermal risk. So that's one of the only tools I know out there that will actually calculate risk for use on the farm.
But in terms of the risk to pollinators, I think neonicotinoids are, extremely disastrous because they do stay in all parts of the plant, and our pollinators are in such decline that it's a problem. So I don't.
Well, that was what we wanted to look at, and unfortunately, the data for that is not actually available because it's not a spray, so it's not reported in the spraying records.
Would you know which of the neonicotinoids are used for seed treatment?
No, I mean you can look that up if you.
Because I have a curve right here that. You can look at it.
The companies that manufacture seeds report what pesticides they actually use on their website, but then you can't find records of where those were actually planted, so there's no way of actually mapping that onto the landscape.
Certainly there's been one that's increased dramatically in the last decade.
More questions?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
From about 100,000 to about 400,000 pounds in California.
I had a question about the epidemiology and the toxicology fields and their role in risk assessment and the way that risk assessment then plays into regulation. Something that Professor Eskenazi had mentioned earlier was that basically human studies, epidemiological studies, are limited, they're expensive, and they're imperfect, I believe you said. And then toxicology studies tend to look at one chemical in isolation, even though I believe, as you put it, there's sort of a swimming pool of chemicals that we're all exposed to every day. And given that there is, as was said, sort of a innocent until proven guilty regulatory approach to most chemicals on the market, you know, the precautionary principle was thrown out. And I guess the problem that I saw with that is the precautionary principle is kind of hard to apply retroactively. There's tens of thousands of things already out there. So neither of those seem to be terribly good regulatory approaches, and neither really seems to fit well with the capabilities, the existing capabilities of epidemiology and toxicology as fields that can help get a handle on risk assessment for these different sorts of substances. And so I was wondering if there are other sorts of options, other sorts of relationships of regulation to these sciences, to the industrial production of these chemicals that you see beyond just the precautionary principle and the sort of innocent until proven guilty, which seem to be not working all that well.
Don't throw the precautionary principle baby out with the bathwater. We use it all the time in regulatory practice. Risk assessors build in uncertainty factors into their risk assessments. Every risk assessment has uncertainty factors, which we utilize when we only have rat studies or dog studies and we want to think about what this means for impacts on human health. So uncertainty factor is an instantiation of the precautionary principle. It's a risk assessor assuming they don't know enough, so they're going to build in an extra amount of protection. We can bolster that. So just, you know, kind of keep in mind, we already do it in little bits and pieces. That kind of thinking can be expanded even within the framework of risk assessment. And there's good reasons for trying to rework risk assessment entirely, where risk assessors have to think not just about the risks posed by a particular chemical, but whether that chemical is even needed in light of the alternatives. So some people advocate alternatives assessment. So there's ways that we could tinker with and rework risk assessment, which right now is the best thing we've got. But we can make it better without some kind of wholesale, complete overhaul.
That's all right. The idea that we need a revolution in our approach is maybe a misnomer or a misunderstanding.
Well, revolution sounds nice, but in the meantime.
Okay, in the meantime, okay.
I'm not even sure we have the information to make it better. And I'm not sure we'll ever get the information to make it better. I think that, you know, having a tenfold safety factor for, you know, neonates is just so arbitrary. We know that, for example, with peroxinase, which is one of the PON1 gene, which is one of the genes that might have something to do with the detoxification of organophosphates, that there's about a 65-fold difference between the most susceptible adult, least susceptible adult and the most susceptible neonate. So it's very arbitrary, and that's one gene, one polymorphism. And we haven't even dealt with, as I said before, the swimming pools, all the chemicals interacting together. There's one more piece that I haven't mentioned because it's very difficult to talk about, but we don't really have good ways of measuring many of these chemicals in the human body. So, for example, the best way that we have for measuring organophosphates, if you're poisoned, is the depression of acetylcholinesterase. But that's if you're poisoned. But what we're talking about here is not poisoning, not frank poisoning. We're talking about low-level chronic exposure. So what do we have to use? We only have something called the dialkyl phosphate metabolites, which is a urinary metabolite. And that urinary metabolite may not really reflect exposure. That is, the chemicals that you're exposed to from drift or from the foods you eat. It may affect the fact that you're exposed to the metabolite itself in the environment. For example, that if people who drink a lot of apple juice may get that metabolite, which may not even be toxic. So we don't have a good way of measuring human exposure to be able to do risk assessment. Not only that, but when I look at someone's dialkyl phosphate metabolite levels, I don't know if those levels are coming from, as I said earlier, oxydemeton methyl or from from malathion. And oxydemeton methyl is so much more toxic than malathion. So we are very limited in risk assessment because we can't measure human exposure easily for many of the pesticides.
Do you have an alternative?
I wish I did.
Yeah. Yeah, and then you, and then probably we're coming to an end.
I wanted to ask a question about, well, somebody referred earlier to incentives for change, or how people get involved in change. And one thing that hasn't really been brought up too much, I think one of you might have mentioned a little, about grower behavior, grower changes. And having worked both in agriculture and analyzed large-scale agriculture changes that occur, I think that one thing that does offer some potential optimism in this area is the fact that growers have realized that the overuse of pesticides that has been pushed by the pesticide vendors, it can contribute to major economic problems for themselves as well as liabilities. Mm-hmm. And we all know, I mean, that does show the strength of the regulatory situation, that, you know, once you start having toxic exposures and illness, then there's increasing regulation, there's insurance problems. So it's like a vicious circle. There's also a vicious circle when you get hooked onto organic, a variety of pesticides that you all know, that you develop resistance, resurgence, pests and pesticides. So it's just a very negative downward spiral. And it takes a lot of effort by independent research often, but also the growers themselves researching and understanding what's happening before they can get off of that. It's very difficult, but I think that that is what sometimes offers hope for people who've made changes and converted to different production systems when they realize this kind of both really bad health impacts that can affect their workers, which affect the productivity and their liabilities, as well as induce change to less toxic and less persistent pesticides. So anyway, I wonder if any of you have thoughts on that or experience with that. And it's not by any means a rosy situation for many people, because a lot of people move to that realization, but it's just something that I've seen where changes happen.
So I think that's an excellent point, and I just want to add that in addition to the stories of people actually making those changes, there's looking at the resources that they have that help them make those changes. So for example, most large growers hire a pest control advisor to help them make their decisions. The vast majority of those pest control advisors are employees of the chemical companies. So if it's required that their pest control advisors must be independent, as is in the Equitable Food Initiative standard, that's one step in the right direction. Then you start creating a market for people trained in integrated pest management, and then that resource is available. And the other big piece of that is you get the big buyers who are saying, we want you to, we're going to buy, you get somebody like Costco who says, we want you to reduce your pesticide use. You sure as hell are going to get growers who are going to respond to that. And if you get some other big buyers who say, we want you to reduce your pesticide use, and here's a way to do it, you can rest assured they're going to start listening and do what they can to make those changes. And that's part of the reason that we're going this route, as a complement to the regulatory work.
So Anne, in response to your question, I'm going to tell you about my observations working in the Salinas Valley for the last 15 years, is that I have seen more agricultural land being taken up by now building housing. And what I'm hearing from the growers, I'm sure you've all heard, is that it's not lucrative at all for them anymore to be farming. They'd rather sell their land and have housing there instead. But I'm actually observing that that is what is happening. There's less farmland than there was before. I'm also, of course, hearing, because we have a community advisory board that includes farm workers and growers, And so we get to hear, and sometimes they're suing each other, we get to hear dialogue, is that when the methyl bromide and fumigants and methyl iodide and all that was happening, the growers were saying, you don't allow us to have this tool, we're going to go to Mexico. And so then you're stuck with, okay, is it okay to intoxicate a Mexican farm worker than a U.S. farm worker? So there's a bigger issue here to me that we haven't really addressed about the global economy, the global agricultural issues. And I don't know very much about it, but I think it needs to be part of this dialogue because we've been talking mostly about locally in the United States. If we're talking about locavore versus organic, well, do I want my strawberries to come from Mexico? Not really. What am I going to do about keeping those strawberries growing here? Do I have to use methyl bromide? That doesn't, or chlorpyrifene, which you know even less about?
Well, we've come to the end of our time, and we have not solved. One more question? Okay.
Thank you. That was actually a fantastic segue into my question, which is about a sort of internationalist perspective on this question. And I think it seems like a sort of necessary frame, not only because the technical questions about how do we do away with pesticides, the examples of that are largely outside of the United States, and there are ample examples globally of agricultural systems that use radically less or no pesticides and feed people successfully, and also because the corporate powers that we face here that seem to so firmly control the political process around pesticides, much of their power is based on displacing those forms of production internationally, right, and substituting commodity agriculture and input-intensive agriculture.
Is there a specific question?
Yes. Could you comment on the prospects for sort of more of an internationalist perspective on the question or a strategy for addressing pesticide use?
Well, just very briefly, the Equitable Food Initiative is, in fact, going to be an international effort. It's just getting underway, but there will be farms in Mexico in the short term and probably some other countries in Latin America as well.
And we have one more?
Yeah, it was actually just kind of quick. I mean, we were talking about the toxicity of
need it, but that it's difficult sometimes for risk assessment to know when one chemical replaces another that was taken off the market because there was enough pushback against that one and it's replaced with something else. And recently, this business with Dow coming out with 2,4-D, I guess isn't that what it's called? A big component of Agent Orange. We know how toxic that is, and so how is it that this is even being considered? That that it's going to be crops resistant to this particular agent because it's another GM crop coming out by.
2,4-D has been used for a long time. It's still being used for right-of-way. That's my understanding.
Oh, really? Because
yeah.
it sounded like this was
It's going to increase the use of it by virtue of making plants that are
resistant to it. So it's just going to be increased. I see. So it's not something new, but it's just.
Yeah, and this. I mean, I think your question also relates back to Anne's question earlier about farmers realizing the impacts of their practices, and I like this consideration of farmers' realizations and all of our realizations, but there's the cultural structures upholding unsustainable agricultural practices are really deep and wide. Sociologists have done some really great work showing just how much meaning farmers attach to having a weed-free, clean monoculture field. That you can realize it all you want, you can have all the data in front of you, but at the end of the day, everyone you know, including yourself, is going to judge you for how weed-free and clean and perfect and industrial your field looks in a lot of areas. So there's all kinds of cultural work that has to happen before we move away from industrial agriculture, and I think I teach my students this because I think it's an important part of getting people to be compassionate for farmers who are doing things that seem so ecologically irrational. And
so are there education programs in place to try to change?
So the institutional recommendations are numerous. The work that I'm thinking of in particular right now, because we were talking about last night, is work by Michael Bell, who studied the Practical Farmers of Iowa, where they develop different ways of getting men especially to communicate with each other. So like big far-reaching stuff that is only somewhat about pesticides, but it's more about how to talk and listen to other people and consider new ideas and make new types of friends. But also, there's a whole bunch of different policy recommendations that we could pursue to level the playing field so that people who are trying to do things sustainably aren't instantly outcompeted by farmers who get to externalize all their costs. So I would be happy to brainstorm a whole bunch of different things with you. The thing is, there's no silver bullet. We need all kinds of different recommendations, and that applies in the international context in some other country as much as it does here.
Okay, thanks very much. Really enjoyed this discussion. Thank you. Thank you. And we'll be around to talk to people individually.
My name is Ann Thrupp, and I'm the executive director of the Berkeley Food Institute. I just want to also thank you all again, to Brenna, Jill, and Margaret, and David for a very interesting, maybe not too optimistic, but I think a good, real discussion of this huge challenge that we face. And having worked in this field myself for many years, it's not that, well, there are definitely interesting things going on to make changes, I think, but it's a huge challenge. And so it's really wonderful that all of you are working in this area. So it's such important work. But on that note, I just want to thank also all of you for coming today and to our Food Exchange series, and thank people who helped make this happen, Nora Gilbert, and is Rosalie still here? Rosalie Fanchel? Okay. And I also want to just let you know that we have this Food Exchange series every month, and our next event will be on March 10th, and is going to be on open access, rethinking resource access in food systems. And then the following month, on April 7th, we're having an event on labor issues, and in particular discussing labor and health, and towards a healthier food system. And May 5th is going to be a workshop on participatory methods in farming systems and food systems. And then on May 21st, where that date is not definite yet, but we're also having an event for the Growing Green Awards that the Berkeley Food Institute is co-sponsoring. And all this information is available on our website, food.berkeley.edu, so you can check out that and other events that we're promoting and encouraging you all to attend to continue this learning process and continue to work together. So also I want to invite all of you to come to our reception that we're having. And Nora, do you want to explain where it's down the hall? Can you? What?
Down the hall that way in room 330. It's the English Departmental Lounge at the top of the steps.
Okay, thank you very much, Nora, for that. So we have a little bit of wine, some food. Hopefully it'll be healthy food, not organic food. So we can continue the conversation. I'm sure there's a lot more to talk about. Thank you again.